Abduction is usually a messy affair involving blinding lights, sheer panic, and a desperate fight for survival. But for Elias Vance, it was simply Tuesday's scheduled meeting. The deserted stretch of Nevada highway offered nothing but scrub brush and a pale moon. The perfect rendezvous point for a man who made his living negotiating the impossible. He had parked his vintage muscle car on the shoulder, checked his gold pocket watch, and waited for the stars to rearrange themselves. When the beam of localized gravity finally slammed down from the sky, pulling him upward into the belly of an invisible dreadnought, Elias did not scream. He simply adjusted his tie. What the extraterrestrial crew did not know was that Elias was carrying a payload far more dangerous than any weapon, and the clock on its activation had already started ticking. Inside the bowels of the scouting vessel, the atmosphere was sterile, cold, and rigidly designed. This ship belonged to the Xylari Empire, a civilization that had conquered countless star systems not through sheer firepower, but through an agonizingly dense bureaucracy and a total lack of imagination. Everything aboard the vessel had a designated form, a proper protocol, and an exact regulation. Their interrogation chamber was no exception. It was a perfectly spherical room constructed of seamless gunmetal gray alloy, dominated by a single, brutally uncomfortable metal chair positioned under a harsh, clinical spotlight. Commander Vale stood behind a one-way observation partition, smoothing his immaculate uniform over his broad, subtly scaled chest. The Xylari were an imposing species, towering over the average human, with angular features and deep-set eyes that processed the universe in cold, hard data points. Vile expected to see what he always saw when they scooped up a primitive life form: mindless terror, frantic thrashing, perhaps a loss of bodily functions. Instead, the human was inspecting his fingernails. Elias Vance sat in the interrogation chair with the casual posture of a man waiting in a high-end dentist's office. He was in his late 40s, his hair heavily salted with gray, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that somehow looked completely unruffled by his recent trip through a tractor beam. He shifted his weight, grimaced, and tapped the armrest with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Vile signaled his guards. It was time to initiate Standard Intimidation Protocol Subsection 4. The thick door hissed open, and Vile strode into the room, flanked by two heavily armored enforcers holding energy rifles. Vile loomed over Elias, projecting his maximum height, waiting for the primate to cower. Elias looked up, squinting slightly against the glare of the spotlight. He cleared his throat. "The lumbar support on this chair is genuinely criminal," Elias said in English. "I realize you are an interstellar empire with a penchant for dramatic lighting, but if we are going to be in here for more than 20 minutes, my chiropractor is going to have a field day. Also, the spotlight is entirely unnecessary. I am quite literally the only thing in the room." Vile paused. He activated the universal translator embedded in his collar. "Silence. Primitive. You are aboard a sovereign vessel of the Xylari High Command. You will speak only when spoken to, and you will answer my inquiries with absolute obedience." Elias smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. He leaned forward, ignoring the way the guards tightened their grips on their rifles. When he spoke next, it was not in English. It was in flawless, highly formalized High Xylari, a dialect reserved entirely for the Empire's aristocratic caste. "Your syntax is a bit rigid, Commander, and your use of the dominant imperative is charmingly provincial," Elias said, letting the alien syllables roll off his tongue with practiced ease. "But I appreciate the attempt at establishing a baseline of authority. It saves us the tedious posturing phase." Vile felt a cold spike of genuine shock pierce his normally disciplined mind. A human speaking High Xylari was statistically impossible. The language required specific vocal cord microcontractions that most species spent decades attempting to master. "How do you possess this dialect?" Vial demanded, his voice dropping an octave, slipping past his strict military bearing. "Identify your handler. Which intelligence agency furnished you with this data?" "Handler?" Elias let out a dry, resonant laugh. "Commander Vial, you misunderstand the dynamic of this room entirely. I am not an operative working for my government. Frankly, my government could not organize a bake sale, let alone a counterintelligence operation against a Tier 2 galactic bureaucracy. I am a private citizen, a fixer, a negotiator, and I am here because I allowed you to bring me here." Vial scoffed, recovering his composure. He stepped closer, leaning over the table to impose his physical superiority. "You are meat caught in a snare. You allowed nothing. Our sensors detected your biological signature isolated on that landmass. We extracted you. You are completely powerless, separated from your world, surrounded by military personnel." "Ah, sensors?" Elias replied casually, crossing his legs. "Fascinating technology. Did your sensors happen to scan the lining of my stomach before you beamed me aboard? Or did your standard operating procedure only mandate a superficial sweep for metallic weapons?" Vial's eyes narrowed. He shot a glance at the guard to his left, who quickly tapped a sequence into a handheld diagnostic scanner. "Because if your medical officers had done their jobs," Elias continued, "they would have noticed a highly sophisticated synthetic biodrive currently dissolving in my gastric acid. I swallowed it roughly an hour before you arrived. It is completely organic, undetectable by standard munition sweeps, and currently sweating microscopic data spores into my bloodstream." The guard's scanner chimed softly, a low note indicating an anomaly. The guard handed the device to Vial. Vial read the screen, his scaled face paling slightly. There was indeed an aggressive, localized radio frequency field emanating directly from the human's core. "What is that?" Vial asked, his tone shifting from authoritative to carefully guarded. "That," Elias said, interlacing his fingers, "is a master key. While we have been sitting here discussing your terrible taste in furniture, my internal drive has been quietly shaking hands with your ship's localized network. You Xylari are obsessed with efficiency. Everything is networked. Life support, navigation, communications, automatic door locks. It is a beautiful system, completely interconnected, and therefore completely vulnerable to an elegant little virus that currently treats my heart rate as its metronome." "Disable it," Vial ordered, stepping back. "Guards, restrain him. Prepare him for vivisection. We will extract the device manually." Elias did not flinch. "I would strongly advise against that. The virus operates on a dead man's switch protocol. If my pulse drops below 50 beats per minute, or if I flatline entirely, the biodrive initiates a broadcast sequence. It will bypass your firewall, access your central communications array, and dump a very specific, highly encrypted data packet directly to the Xylari High Command." "A bluff," Vial said, though he did not sound convinced. "You possess no data of value." "Let us test that theory," Elias said, leaning back and resting his head against the cold metal chair. "Let us talk about Sector 4. Specifically, let us talk about the missing cargo manifest from the supply depot orbiting the moon of Krytos." Vial froze. The guards remained perfectly still, oblivious to the context, but Vial's entire posture locked up. "I see I have your attention," Elias noted, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. "According to my sources, 40,000 metric tons of refined Ethereum vanished from your Watch 3 planetary cycles ago. You logged it as a pirate raid, a tragic loss for the Empire. But pirate raids are messy. They leave debris. They leave plasma scoring. They do not leave perfectly balanced accounting ledgers and heavily padded offshore accounts in the Centauri Banking Guild. Vile felt the air in the room grow suffocatingly thin. This was top secret. This was treason. If the High Command discovered his embezzlement, the penalty was public execution. I know about the upcoming court-martial waiting for you back on your homeworld. Vile. Elias continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. I know your superiors are suspicious. I know this scouting mission to Earth is a punishment detail, a way to keep you out of sight while they compile the evidence against you. And most importantly, I have that evidence. Digitized, categorized, and currently queued up for broad-spectrum transmission the moment my heart stops beating. Vile stared at the human. The paradigm of the room had shifted so violently and entirely that Vile was struggling to process the data. The human was not sweating. The human was not afraid. The human was looking at him with the cold, calculating gaze of an apex predator who had just locked the cage from the inside. What do you want? Vile asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. Elias Vance stood up. The guards raised their weapons, but Vile sharply raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. Elias dusted off his suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and looked around the sterile interrogation room with utter disdain. First of all, Elias said, stepping right up to the towering alien commander, I want a better chair. Second, we are going to need a translator because speaking High Xylari gives me a terrible migraine. And third, Commander Vile, you are going to take me to the bridge. We have a great deal of work to do, and I do not tolerate lateness. Elias walked past the heavily armed guards without giving them a second glance, stepping out into the polished corridor of the alien vessel. He had been on this ship for less than an hour, and he had already taken the commander hostage. The real negotiation was just beginning. Control is a fragile illusion, easily shattered the moment the captive starts dictating the itinerary. Commander Vale's heavy boots struck the polished composite flooring of the corridor in a rapid, angry rhythm as he caught up to his prisoner. Elias Vance was strolling down the austere, gray-paneled hallway with his hands casually tucked into his pockets, examining the intricate circuitry lines running along the bulkheads as if he were touring a contemporary art gallery. Vile grabbed Elias by the shoulder and spun him around. The two armored guards instantly raised their energy rifles, the air humming with lethal potential. You overstep, human, Vile growled, his scaled facial ridges flushing a deep, aggressive violet. You claim to possess a virus, but I command a vessel equipped with a quantum-encrypted mainframe. A biological anomaly in your bloodstream cannot simply override military-grade architecture. I will lock you in a stasis pod and let the High Command dissect you upon our arrival. Elias calmly brushed Vile's massive hand off his tailored jacket. He adjusted his cuffs, his expression entirely devoid of fear. Quantum encryption is impressive when you are fighting a frontal assault, Elias said, pointing a finger upward at the ceiling grates. But my biodrive did not attack your front door. It slipped through the plumbing. Let us talk about your life support loop, Vile, specifically the atmospheric scrubbers on Deck 4. Vile narrowed his eyes. The scrubbers operate independently of the main navigation array. Exactly, Elias replied, a sharp smile forming. Which means they are functionally ignored by your brilliant quantum security. 10 minutes ago, my virus noticed a manufactured flaw in your oxygen recycling protocol. It rewrote a single line of code. If I tap my chest twice, or if you decide to shoot me, my biodrive sends a micropulse that reverses the pressure valves on Deck 4. Instead of filtering carbon dioxide, the system will flood the lower crew barracks with lethal, concentrated levels of it. Vale stared at the human, then activated the communication node on his wrist. He demanded a diagnostic of the Deck 4 atmospheric controls from his engineering officer. A voice responded over the secure channel, confirming an unauthorized partition had isolated the valves. The engineer reported they were entirely locked out of the system. Vial lowered his wrist, his imposing posture deflating by a fraction of an inch. "You are a monster," Vial said softly. "I am a pragmatist," Elias corrected, turning back to continue his walk down the corridor. "Now, as I mentioned, speaking your aristocratic dialect is giving me a profound headache. Bring me a translator. I want to speak in English. It allows for nuance." Vial led Elias into a sterile observation lounge overlooking the vast, swirling expanse of deep space. Vial barked an order to a subordinate, and within moments the heavy doors opened to admit a new arrival. It was a woman, though her species was distinctly non-human. She possessed pale, almost translucent skin with faint bioluminescent patterns tracing the line of her jaw and collarbones. Her eyes were solid pools of obsidian. Around her neck sat a thick, oppressive metallic collar that pulsed with a dull red light, contrasting sharply with the simple, coarse gray garments of a prisoner. She moved with a quiet, defeated grace, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. "This is Lyra," Vial announced with a dismissive wave of his hand. "She is a member of the Oleri. They possess rudimentary telepathic processing abilities. The collar dampens her psychic output but allows her to act as a localized linguistic bridge. Speak your primitive language. She will project the translation directly into my auditory receptors." Elias looked at Lyra. He did not see a biological machine or a subjugated asset. He saw leverage, and more importantly, he saw a person trapped in a nightmare. Elias immediately stepped forward, bypassing Vial entirely, and pulled out one of the heavy metallic chairs at the observation table. "Please have a seat," Elias said in English, offering her a warm, genuine smile. Lyra blinked, looking up at him in profound confusion. Xylari officers never offered seats. They offered orders, and occasionally, punishment. She hesitated, glancing nervously at Vial, who simply scowled in profound irritation at the human's baffling behavior. Slowly, Lyra sat down. "Thank you," she projected. The voice did not come from her lips. It manifested directly inside Elias's mind, clear and melodic, carrying a faint echo of profound sorrow. "My pleasure," Elias replied aloud. "I am Elias. It is incredibly rude of our hosts to make you wear such a heavy piece of jewelry. I imagine it chafes." Lyra's eyes widened slightly. She turned to Vial and translated the human's words into standard Xylari. Vial crossed his arms, looking completely unamused. But in the quiet space of Elias's mind, another projection arrived. It was not a translation, it was a feeling, a sudden, sharp spark of amusement, followed by a deeply buried sense of curiosity. "He is terrified of you," Lyra's voice whispered in his thoughts, bypassing the room's physical acoustics entirely. "His heart rate is elevated. He fears the tribunal on his homeworld more than he fears death." Elias did not break eye contact with Vial, but his smile widened. He had found an ally, a direct telepathic wiretap into his opponent's emotional state. "Tell the commander," Elias said aloud, projecting an air of absolute boredom, "that my current accommodations in the detention block are entirely unacceptable. If I am to maintain the exact resting heart rate required to keep his crew from suffocating on their own recycled breath, I require adequate nutrition. I want full access to the officers' mess hall." Lyra translated the demand. Vial stepped forward, slamming a fist onto the table. "Absolutely denied," Vial shouted. "You are a prisoner of the state. You will eat the standard nutritional paste in your cell, or you will starve." "He is bluffing," Lyra's voice echoed in Elias's mind. He cannot risk the structural damage to the ship if you die. Elias leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms behind his head. Nutritional paste. How tragic. I suppose I will just have to panic. Then, I am feeling quite anxious suddenly. My pulse is rising. I wonder how the atmospheric scrubbers on Deck 4 handle a panic attack. Vial's rigid posture broke. He looked at the observation window, then back at the human. He was a military commander trained to fight armadas, outmaneuver plasma torpedoes, and conquer planetary defense grids. He was entirely unequipped to fight a man in a bespoke suit armed with nothing but audacity and a stomach ache. Fine. Vial spat the word out. You may utilize the officer's mess. Under heavy guard. Excellent, Elias said, clapping his hands together once. Furthermore, I require upgraded sleeping quarters. The detention cell lacks proper ventilation. Put me in the VIP suites, the ones you reserve for visiting planetary governors. Vial looked at Lyra, as if the translator had somehow malfunctioned. You demand the diplomatic suite? I demand a good night's sleep, Elias corrected. You do not make me repeat myself, Vial. I am the most valuable, dangerous piece of cargo you have ever brought aboard this vessel. Treat me accordingly, or I will turn this ship into a floating tomb before we even reach the next star system. Vial stared at the human for a long, heavy moment. The power dynamic in the room had completely inverted. The Conqueror was taking orders from the Conquered. Vial gave a sharp, jerky nod of concession and turned to the door, his pride utterly pulverized. Now, Elias said, his voice dropping the playful tone and adopting the razor-sharp edge of a seasoned negotiator closing a deal. Let us discuss our itinerary. You are currently on a vector for the Xylari homeworld. That is a terrible idea for both of us. Vial stopped at the door and turned around. It is the designated route. We must return to the fleet. If you return to the fleet, Elias said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, you face a military tribunal for embezzling 40,000 metric tons of refined Ethereum. You will be stripped of your rank, publicly humiliated, and likely executed. If you take me to the homeworld, I become a laboratory experiment. Neither of those outcomes aligns with my schedule. Elias tapped his fingers rhythmically against the metal table. I am setting a deadline. You have exactly 12 hours to alter the ship's navigation parameters. You are going to turn this vessel around and plot a course for the neutral zone located in the Orion Spur. The Orion Spur is lawless territory, Vial protested, genuine alarm creeping into his voice. It is populated by scavengers and exiled syndicates. The High Command will track us. They will send the Armada. Let me worry about the Armada, Elias replied coldly. You have 12 hours, Commander, if we cross the outer perimeter of the Xylari homeworld system. My dead man's switch bypasses your communications array and broadcasts your heavily padded Centauri banking ledgers to every commanding officer in your fleet. You will die a traitor before you even touch down. Vial looked at Elias, then at Lyra, realizing he was entirely trapped by his own secrets. Without another word, the alien commander stormed out of the observation lounge, the heavy doors sliding shut behind him. Elias let out a long breath and loosened his tie. He looked over at Lyra, who was staring at him with wide, obsidian eyes. The pulsing red light of her collar cast harsh shadows across her pale skin. You are going to kill us all. Lyra projected into his mind, her mental voice a mixture of awe and terror. No, Elias said aloud, offering her a reassuring wink. I am going to save us. But first, we need to figure out how to get that hideous collar off your neck. He had secured the ship, the comfort, and the leverage. Now, Elias Vance needed to prepare for the inevitable retaliation, and he wondered just how far Lyra's telepathic abilities could reach once the chains were finally removed. The clock was ticking, and the real game had just begun. A bureaucracy is a beast of burden that only knows how to walk in straight lines, making it spectacularly easy to walk off a cliff. Elias Vance was currently drawing the map to the edge. From the plush, temperature-controlled confines of his newly acquired diplomatic suite, Elias began his assault on the ship's central artificial intelligence. The VIP quarters offered a direct, high-level interface with the mainframe, a perk usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Now, it was a weapon. Using a combination of his internalized biodrive and a stolen officer's datapad, Elias flooded the ship's administrative logic core with thousands of pages of entirely fictional interstellar compliance mandates. He introduced the highly literal AI to the concept of the Galactic Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He coded an immediate, mandatory requirement that all bulkheads must pass a non-existent multi-phase environmental impact study before cycling open. He created a logical paradox where the ship's internal transport elevators could only be operated by personnel who had completed a zero-gravity sensitivity training seminar, which unfortunately could only be unlocked by personnel with active elevator clearance. He even mandated that the synthesized food dispensers require notarized dietary waivers in triplicate before releasing anything more complex than room-temperature water. The results were immediate and catastrophic for a species that lacked the capacity for nuance or improvisation. The Xylari crew, conditioned from birth to follow automated orders to the letter, found themselves utterly paralyzed. Within 2 hours, the engineering bay doors locked tight. Armed enforcers stood frozen in the corridors, unable to advance because a new protocol classified their heavy metallic boots as a hazardous noise violation during newly implemented ship-wide quiet hours. Lieutenant commanders argued vehemently with flat-screen terminals, completely unable to comprehend why they needed the signature of a fictional chief morale officer to flush the coolant lines. The mighty scout ship ground to a complete, humiliating halt. Elias simply poured himself a glass of water, leaned back in his luxurious chair, and activated the ship-wide intercom. "Attention, crew of the Xylari scout vessel," Elias announced, his voice echoing cleanly through the static-free speakers. "I understand there is some confusion regarding the new regulatory compliance updates. Do not panic. As a recognized external auditor, I am authorizing a temporary emergency override for essential functions. Engineering team, you are granted provisional clearance to manually bypass the bulkhead relays. Security detail, please file a noise exemption form with me directly. But you may resume patrol at a reduced pace. Let us keep things orderly." It was a masterclass in psychological domination. Elias was not firing weapons or issuing threats. He was simply stepping into the void of authority created by his own sabotage, because he was the only individual capable of providing clear, functioning directives through the maze of conflicting automated orders. The crew began to listen to him. They needed a commander who could make the ship work, and Vial was currently locked in his quarters, paralyzed by the fear of his own financial exposure. By the end of the day, Elias Vance was practically running the daily operations of an alien dreadnought without ever raising his voice. But the real work happened after the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate the night cycle. In the quiet sanctuary of the diplomatic suite, the dynamic shifted from grand strategy to intimate collaboration. Lyra sat across from Elias at a sleek, obsidian workstation. The oppressive, pulsing metal collar was gone. Elias had used his new administrative privileges to completely wipe the restraint protocol from the ship's registry, allowing the heavy device to unlatch and fall to the floor earlier that afternoon. Without the collar dampening her abilities, Lyra's presence expanded beautifully. The air around her seemed to carry a faint, ozone-scented charge. Her telepathic communication was no longer a strained, forced projection, but a fluid, natural current that flowed effortlessly into Elias's mind, carrying vivid shades of emotion and memory alongside her words. They spent the late hours dissecting the heavily encrypted Xylari warp drive codes. Elias needed the ship to jump to the Orion Spur neutral zone, and he could not trust Vael's navigation officers to plot the course without triggering a silent distress beacon to the Armada. Their firewall architecture is incredibly rigid. Lyra projected, her dark eyes tracing the complex alien symbols scrolling across the holographic display. It assumes an external attack from a hostile fleet. It does not account for an authorized user slowly dismantling it from the inside. That is the beauty of blind faith in a system, Elias replied aloud, leaning closer to point at a string of code. They build walls so high they forget to check if anyone left a ladder on the inside. Shift that mathematical sequence to the secondary logic processor. We can trick the navigation array into thinking it is running a harmless diagnostic simulation. Lyra nodded, her fingers dancing gracefully across the haptic interface. She paused, looking up at him. The ambient light of the holoscreen cast a soft, ethereal glow across the bioluminescent patterns tracing her jawline. A thought entered his mind, carrying a deep, resonant warmth. It was Lyra, speaking directly to his consciousness. You are a strange creature, Elias Vance. You lie to entire armies with a calm smile, yet your mind is rigidly dedicated to a solitary concept of freedom. You operate entirely in shadows, but your intentions are startlingly bright. Elias met her gaze, feeling a sudden, unexpected tightening in his chest. He was accustomed to dealing with politicians and corporate executives who wore heavy, practiced masks. He was a professional liar by trade, but Lyra could feel the exact texture of his thoughts. She knew he was not a conqueror, but a man who despised cages of any kind. She could feel his underlying loneliness, the toll his life of constant negotiation had taken on him. And in return, he could sense her profound relief, the serene beauty of the homeworld she had been stolen from, and the fierce intelligence burning beneath her quiet demeanor. A freedom is just a negotiation where you refuse to accept the counteroffer, Elias said softly, his voice dropping the practiced bravado. Lyra reached out, her pale fingertips gently brushing the back of his hand. It was a simple physical gesture, but the contact sent a rush of genuine, unshielded emotion between them. A shared ache for liberation, a mutual recognition of the scars they both carried from a universe that constantly tried to bend them to its will. The romantic tension in the room thickened, a quiet, undeniable gravity pulling them together against the backdrop of a hostile, metallic alien vessel. We will break their chains, Lyra promised, her mental voice a fierce, intimate whisper. Together. But while romance blossomed in the safety of the diplomatic suite, a toxic resentment was reaching a boiling point in the bowels of the lower decks. The Xylari military machine did not break easily. While the majority of the crew sheepishly accepted Elias's administrative overrides, just to keep the ship functioning and avoid the disciplinary algorithms, a faction of highly trained loyalist guards viewed the situation with absolute disgust. Deep within the armory, far from the reach of the ship's internal surveillance grids that Elias now monitored, Centurion Vorek assembled 12 heavily armored soldiers. Vorek was a traditionalist, a veteran of brutal planetary pacification campaigns who believed in the absolute unyielding supremacy of the High Command. He viewed Commander Vael's capitulation to a single, unarmed human as the ultimate disgrace to their species. The commander has lost his mind to fear. Vorek addressed his men, his voice a low, gravelly growl of pure malice. He cowers in his quarters while a primitive dictates our sleep cycles and navigation vectors. The ship's logic core is corrupted by this bureaucratic disease. The chain of command is broken. The soldiers murmured in agreement, their scaled hands resting tightly on the grips of their heavy plasma rifles. "We are Xylari," Vorek continued, his eyes burning with a fanatical devotion. "We do not surrender sovereign vessels. We do not take orders from a species that has not even mastered localized gravity manipulation. The human claims to hold a biological trigger that will destroy Vial's reputation. I do not care about Vial's reputation. If the commander falls, it is his own weakness. I care only about the honor of the Empire." Vorek slammed a heavy fist against the armory table, the impact echoing sharply against the weapons racks. "We will bypass the corrupted bulkheads manually by crawling through the primary ventilation shafts." Vorek outlined the plan, tracing a route on a physical schematic rolled out on the table. We will move in total radio silence to avoid alerting the ship's central AI. We will breach the diplomatic suite, and we will execute the human and his telepathic pet. Once the primitive is dead, whatever virus he has implanted will cease to matter, and we will restore order to this vessel by force. The mutiny was born in the shadows, fueled by a dangerous mixture of pride and fury. They loaded their weapons, setting the energy outputs to maximum lethality. They did not care about the hostages, the internal politics, or the impending court-martial. They only cared about spilling human blood and reclaiming their ship. Up in the VIP suite, Elias rubbed his tired eyes, entirely unaware that 12 heavily armed traditionalists were currently cutting through the heavy grating of the maintenance shafts. Determined to bypass his carefully constructed bureaucratic fortress, he was only a few lines of code away from locking in the hyperspace coordinates for their escape. But a faint, rhythmic vibration began to hum against the soles of his shoes. The illusion of complete control was about to face a very violent reality test. A well-laid trap is only as good as the prey's absolute certainty that they are the hunters. Centurion Vorek and his heavily armed death squad were about to discover that Elias Vance never left a back door unguarded. The faint rhythmic vibration beneath Elias's leather shoes was not a mechanical failure, but the synchronized crawling of 12 heavily armored Xylari traditionalists moving through the primary ventilation shafts directly above the diplomatic suite. Vorek had plotted the route perfectly, bypassing the main corridors and avoiding the automated security checkpoints Elias had recently tangled in red tape. They positioned themselves directly over the ventilation grate in the ceiling of the VIP lounge, preparing to drop into the room, execute the human, and restore the absolute authority of the Empire. Vorek raised a scaled hand, signaling his men to prime their energy rifles for maximum lethality. Down below, Elias calmly took a sip of his perfectly chilled water. He did not look up at the ceiling. He simply looked at Lyra. Her obsidian eyes widened, catching the violent, jagged spikes of raw telepathic aggression bleeding down from the metal ducts above. She did not need to speak. Her mind flashed a vivid warning into Elias's consciousness, painting a clear picture of the imminent ambush. Elias smiled, setting his glass down on the obsidian workstation. He had anticipated a physical pushback. A bureaucracy as rigid as the Xylari Empire could not be dismantled purely by administrative frustration. Eventually, the old guard would try to bite back. Elias tapped a single key on his stolen datapad. He had not just rewritten the ship's occupational safety guidelines. He had also taken the liberty of reclassifying the diplomatic suite's fire suppression system into an automated riot control measure. Before Vorek could even issue the command to breach the grate, the pacification protocol initiated. The ship's internal gravimetric plating reversed polarity exclusively within the confines of the ventilation shafts surrounding the suite. The 12 heavily armored soldiers suddenly found themselves falling upward with bone-crushing force, pinned violently against the upper curvature of the metal ducts by 10 times the standard gravity. Vorak gasped for breath as his own chest plate compressed his lungs, his energy rifle pinned uselessly to the metal beneath him. "Attention all personnel," the ship's AI announced in a calm, melodic tone. "Unauthorized maintenance detected in Ventilation Sector 4. Deploying localized heavy-gravity stabilization to ensure crew safety during the infraction." In the suite below, Elias dusted off his hands. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, but a cornered zealot is a dangerous variable. Trapped against the top of the duct, his vision swimming from the immense gravitational pressure, Vorak realized his mutiny had failed. The human had outsmarted them without firing a single shot. In the twisted, fanatical logic of the Xylari loyalist, there was only one acceptable response to the total loss of a sovereign vessel: death before dishonor. Vorak managed to free one hand, fighting the crushing weight of the artificial gravity, and blindly reached for the manual emergency maintenance panel embedded in the wall of the shaft. He forced the cover open and entered a deeply classified 10-digit alphanumeric sequence. The gravity plating instantly returned to normal, dropping the bruised and battered soldiers back onto the floor of the duct. But the relief was entirely overshadowed by the screaming, high-pitched klaxon that suddenly erupted throughout the entire ship. The ambient lighting shifted from a soothing, cool blue to a harsh, pulsating crimson. "Warning," the ship's AI declared, its melodic tone replaced by a digitized blare of absolute urgency. "Manual scuttle protocol initiated. Warp core overload in exactly 10 minutes. All digital administrative overrides are suspended. This sequence cannot be aborted remotely." Elias stood up, his casual demeanor evaporating instantly. Vorak had bypassed the mainframe entirely and triggered a physical chain reaction in the ship's engine room. The heavy doors to the diplomatic suite hissed open, and Commander Vale practically threw himself into the room. The towering alien commander was stripped of his immaculate uniform jacket, his scaled face a portrait of sheer, unadulterated panic. The self-destruct protocol had immediately severed the command network from the main AI to prevent external hacking, effectively locking Vale out of his own ship's systems. He had run frantically from his quarters, dodging panicked crew members. "The mutineers engaged the core overload," Vale shouted, his massive chest heaving. "I have no digital access. You locked the engineering bulkheads with your administrative sabotage, and now the system will not recognize my command codes to open them. We are going to burn human." Vael, the proud military commander of the Xylari Empire, was standing in front of his captive, openly begging for salvation. "I cannot fix this with a datapad," Elias stated, rapidly analyzing the variables. "If the digital network is severed, we need to physically reach the warp core and manually drop the dampening rods back into the reactor." "The engineering decks are a hazard zone," Vael argued, his voice tight with desperation. "The scuttle protocol automatically vents the plasma conduits to accelerate the core meltdown. The localized gravity generators down there have already shut down to conserve power for the explosion. We cannot survive the trek." "We will survive," Lyra projected, her mental voice a steady, calming anchor amidst the blaring alarms. "I can sense the plasma surges before they erupt. I can guide us through the blind spots." Elias looked at Vael, his eyes hard and uncompromising. "You know the physical layout of the reactor. I have the necessary agility and the total lack of self-preservation required for this kind of stupidity. Lyra has the radar. We move now, or we all become stardust." Vael nodded sharply, the shared threat of total annihilation instantly forging an unlikely, desperate alliance. The three of them sprinted out of the suite, diving into the chaotic labyrinth of the ship's lower decks. The descent into the engineering sector was a nightmare of failing technology. The red emergency lighting flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows against the metallic bulkheads. As they crossed the threshold into Deck 7, the artificial gravity completely vanished. Elias felt his stomach lurch as his feet left the floor. He grabbed a heavy metal handhold mounted on the wall, dragging himself forward through the weightless environment. "My tailor is going to be incredibly upset about the state of this suit," Elias muttered, pulling himself hand over hand along the corridor. "Halt!" Lyra projected sharply into both of their minds. Elias and Viel froze, clinging to the wall plating. A split second later, a massive jet of superheated blue plasma erupted from a ruptured conduit directly in front of them, incinerating the air where they would have been floating. The heat washed over Elias's face, singeing the edges of his hair. "Clear," Lyra announced. They pushed off the walls, floating rapidly through the dissipating heat haze. They navigated a deadly obstacle course of floating debris, collapsing support beams, and unpredictable thermal vents, relying entirely on Lyra's telepathic foresight and Viel's intimate knowledge of the ship's architecture. They finally reached the primary reactor chamber. The warp core was a towering cylindrical monument of alien engineering, currently glowing with a blinding, furious white light. The hum of the overloaded reactor was a physical force, vibrating deep within their bones. The countdown clock on the main console displayed less than 90 seconds until total containment failure. "The manual dampening rods are housed in those two elevated alcoves," Viel shouted over the deafening roar of the core, pointing to two heavy metallic levers positioned on opposite sides of the massive cylindrical reactor. "They must be pulled down simultaneously to starve the reaction. But the locking mechanism requires a third person to hold the release switch at the primary terminal." "Get to the left lever," Elias ordered Viel, instantly taking command. "Lyra, take the terminal." "I will take the right." They scrambled into position. Elias climbed the maintenance ladder to the right alcove, his muscles burning with exertion. The heat radiating off the core was agonizing, threatening to blister his skin. He grabbed the heavy metallic lever, feeling the intense vibration of the dying star trapped inside the machine. Across the chamber, Viel mirrored his position, his massive hands gripping the left lever. Lyra stood at the primary console, her fingers hovering over the glowing release switch. "On my mark," Elias yelled, his voice barely cutting through the mechanical roar. He watched the countdown. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. "Now." Lyra slammed her hand onto the release switch. Elias and Viel threw their entire body weight backward, hauling the heavy dampening rods down with agonizing effort. The levers groaned, resisting the movement, fighting against the immense pressure of the overloaded core. Elias gritted his teeth, his tailored suit completely ruined, sweat pouring down his face as he forced the lever down until it locked into place with a heavy, metallic slam. The blinding white light of the warp core instantly shifted to a dull, angry orange, then faded into a stable, pulsing blue. The deafening roar pitched down into a low, manageable hum. The heavy vibration in the floor panels ceased. The red emergency lighting flickered out, replaced by the standard cool illumination of the engineering deck. They had stopped the countdown with exactly 3 seconds to spare. Elias slumped against the railing of the alcove, gasping for air, his chest heaving. Across the reactor room, Viel slowly let go of his lever. The alien commander looked up at Elias. The sheer panic had drained from Viel's face, replaced by a profound, complex expression. It was the look of a man who had just watched his entire worldview get dismantled by a prisoner in a ruined charcoal suit. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Elias Vance was no longer just a hostage armed with a clever computer virus. He was the man who had physically dragged Viel and his ship back from the edge of oblivion. Viel offered a slow, stiff nod of undeniable respect. Elias climbed down the ladder and walked over to Lyra. She was trembling slightly from the immense exertion of filtering the sensory data of an exploding ship. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a quiet smile of gratitude. They had survived the mutiny and the meltdown, but as Elias looked at the main engineering console, a cold realization settled into his stomach. The scuttle protocol had been aborted, but the massive, uncontrolled energy spike generated by the near detonation had not been contained. It had vented outward, a blinding beacon of raw radiation pulsing into the dark void of space. A flare that bright would be visible to long-range sensors across half the sector. Elias knew exactly who was looking for them, and he knew that their quiet, isolated game of cat and mouse was officially over. A distress flare in the vacuum of space does not politely ask for assistance. It rings the dinner bell for apex predators. The massive energy spike from the aborted core meltdown had barely dissipated before the stars outside the observation lounge began to warp and bleed. Space itself seemed to tear open, birthing a jagged rift of purple hyperspace energy. From that tear emerged the Xylari Armada. It was not a simple fleet. It was a floating, heavily armored city block designed to blot out the suns of non-compliant worlds. Dozens of angular dreadnoughts flanked a central flagship so colossal it possessed its own gravitational pull. The sheer scale of the military force was enough to make the air in the scout ship's bridge feel instantly suffocating. Commander Vial stared at the main view screen, his posture crumbling. The mutiny had been dealt with, the Loyalists locked safely in a holding cell, and the ship was functional again. But none of that mattered now. He was staring at his own executioners. "That is the dreadnought Vanguard," Vial said, his voice entirely devoid of hope. "High Commander Kalen is aboard. He does not negotiate. He does not take prisoners who hold compromising banking ledgers. He will simply turn this vessel into slag and report us as casualties of a primitive weapon malfunction." Elias Vance stood beside Vial, brushing a layer of soot off his ruined charcoal jacket. Kalen sounds like a man who takes his job far too seriously. Let us see how he handles a performance review. Before Vial could protest, the main communication console lit up with a harsh, glaring red light. A forced transmission bypassed their security protocols, filling the large screen with the imposing visage of High Commander Kalen. He was older than Vial, his scales pale and scarred, his eyes radiating a fanatic devotion to the Empire. "Commander Vial," Kalen commanded, his voice booming through the bridge speakers with terrifying authority. "Your vessel has broadcast an unauthorized thermal bloom. Your navigation vectors are highly irregular. You will lower your defensive screens, power down your engines, and prepare to be boarded. I am aware you have taken a human captive. You will execute the primitive immediately. Resistance will result in your immediate disintegration." Vial opened his mouth, completely paralyzed by a lifetime of absolute military conditioning. He could not speak. He could not defy the High Commander. Elias gently nudged Vial aside and stepped directly into the center of the camera's frame. He straightened his posture, clasped his hands behind his back, and projected an aura of absolute, terrifying boredom. "High Commander Kalen," Elias began, speaking in his flawlessly accented High Xylari. "I am afraid Commander Vial is currently unable to complete your request. He is on administrative leave pending the results of my inspection." Kalen's eyes narrowed into slits of pure fury. A human speaking the high tongue. What is this trickery? Identify yourself, Primate, before I reduce you to ash. Primate is a bit colloquial for a Tier 1 galactic auditor, Elias replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with the imposing alien on the screen. My name is Elias Vance. I represent the Omega Consortium. We are the sovereign regulatory body overseeing the territorial expansion of the Orion Spur. And frankly, Kalen, Your fleet's synergistic paradigm alignment is a complete disaster. On the bridge, Vile looked at Elias as if the human had suddenly sprouted a second head. Lyra, standing near the auxiliary console, projected a wave of nervous amusement directly into Elias's mind. "You are inventing a superpower out of thin air," she noted. "Just follow my lead." Elias projected back. "And get ready to hit the main thrusters." "I do not know what the Omega Consortium is," Kalen growled, leaning closer to his own camera. "There are no sovereign bodies in this sector capable of challenging the Empire. You are a liar attempting to delay your own execution. Ignorance of galactic zoning ordinances does not excuse your violation of them," Elias countered, his tone adopting the sharp, condescending edge of an annoyed middle manager. "Earth is a Class A protected nursery world under the jurisdiction of the Omega Fleet. By abducting me, your scout ship initiated a massive diplomatic incident. By bringing an entire armed armada to our border, you have technically declared war on a civilization that possesses localized reality warping technology. Did your intelligence officers completely fail to brief you on the Sol System Exclusion Act?" Kalen hesitated. The Xylari were a species built entirely on rules, reports, and data. If data was missing, they faltered. A system rigid enough to conquer star clusters was also brittle enough to snap when presented with an entirely unrecognizable framework. Elias was bombarding him with a completely fabricated set of interstellar laws, using their own love of bureaucracy as a bludgeon against them. "Our intelligence indicates Earth is a primitive, divided society," Kalen stated, though a fraction of his absolute certainty had chipped away. "You have not even mastered basic fusion drives," Elias laughed. It was a cold, pitying sound. "We also have not mastered stone tools recently. Do you think a civilization capable of erasing a dreadnought from existence simply advertises its technology on a public broadcast? We keep our true capabilities hidden to avoid dealing with aggressive, mid-tier empires like yours. If you fire a single shot at this vessel, Kalen, the Omega Fleet will not just destroy your armada, they will file a punitive class action injunction against your homeworld that will freeze your entire economy for the next 4,000 solar cycles." The sheer audacity of the threat hung heavily in the dead space between the ships. Elias was playing a dangerous game of poker, pushing all his chips into the center of the table while holding absolutely nothing. He was betting everything on the assumption that a structured military mind would be terrified of an unknown administrative variable. For a moment, it seemed to work. The bridge of the Vanguard fell silent. Kalen was consulting off-screen with his tactical officers, trying to cross-reference the Sol System Exclusion Act in a database that did not contain it. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on Elias's shoulders. He kept his expression perfectly neutral, a predator waiting for the prey to blink. Lyra's mental voice brushed against his thoughts, carrying a sharp spike of genuine fear. His pride is overriding his confusion. He is a conqueror, Elias. He cannot retreat from a single human without losing the respect of his fleet. Lyra was right. The fatal flaw of authoritarian regimes was that they could never afford to look weak. Kalen turned back to the screen, his scaled face flushing with a violent violet rage. The momentary hesitation had vanished, replaced by a cold, murderous resolve. He had decided that the risk of a galactic war was preferable to the humiliation of being bullied by a man in a torn suit. "There is no Omega Fleet," Kalen declared, his voice devoid of all emotion. "There is no consortium. You are a biological anomaly, and you have corrupted one of my commanders. I will not engage in further verbal sparring with an inferior species." Kalen raised his hand, a universal gesture of execution. Tactical. Power up the main plasma batteries. Initiate a localized tractor beam lock on the scout ship. We will reel them in, cut the hull open, and cleanse the vessel of this infection manually. The transmission cut out, leaving the main screen displaying the terrifying reality of the massive dreadnought hovering outside. The dark hull of the Vanguard began to glow with a sickly, building green light as their primary weapons banks charged. The console in front of Lyra began to scream a digitized warning. A heavy, invisible force slammed into their scout ship, violently rattling the deck plating. The ambient lighting flickered as the massive tractor beam from the flagship locked onto their hull, seizing them in an unbreakable gravimetric grip. The mighty scout ship was suddenly nothing more than a fish caught on a colossal hook. Being dragged slowly toward the gaping maw of the dreadnought's primary hangar bay. "We are locked," Vial yelled over the blaring alarms, his hands flying across his useless terminal. "The tractor beam is overriding our navigational thrusters. We have less than 3 minutes before we are pulled inside their shields. Once we cross that threshold, they will board us." Elias gripped the edge of the communication console, his knuckles turning white. His grand bluff had failed. The bureaucratic shield had shattered against the hard, unyielding hammer of overwhelming military force. He looked at the massive, glowing dreadnought pulling them towards certain death, realizing that clever words and fake ordinances had finally reached their absolute limit. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and physically tethered to their own destruction. Elias turned to Vial and Lyra, the mask of the calm, calculating negotiator finally dropping to reveal the desperate survivor underneath. If he could not talk his way out of this trap, he was going to have to break it, and he needed to know exactly how much structural integrity an alien scout ship had before it tore itself apart. Survival is rarely a matter of superior firepower. It is usually a contest to see who is willing to do something completely unhinged first. The dreadnought Vanguard was pulling them inexorably toward a sterilized holding cell and a firing squad. Elias Vance knew that playing tug-of-war with a moon-sized warship was a mathematical impossibility, which meant the only option left was to cheat the physics entirely. The bridge of the scout ship groaned under the immense gravimetric strain. The tractor beam was an invisible, unbreakable chain dragging them backward. Vial's hands flew across his console, his military discipline completely fracturing as every countermeasure returned a failure notification. The ship was functioning, but it was captured. Elias looked at the main view screen. Behind the imposing bulk of the Vanguard, a swirling, violent storm of cosmic debris filled the sensor readouts. It was the jagged, densely packed remnants of a shattered moon, a chaotic asteroid field spinning with lethal, unpredictable velocity. "Vial," Elias commanded, his voice slicing through the panic. "Cut the reverse thrusters. We are not going to pull away from them. We are going to drive forward. We are going to use their tether as a pendulum." Vial stared at him, his scaled face utterly blank. "That is a debris field composed of high-density silicates. If we enter that zone at current speeds, the ship will be pulverized. If we stay on this trajectory, we will be executed." Elias fired back. "The tractor beam is a straight line of gravimetric force. If we swing our ship into that asteroid field, the dreadnought has to either drag us through billions of tons of solid rock, which will shatter their beam emitters, or they have to let us go. Give me maximum forward thrust, angled 30 degrees starboard, now." Vial hesitated. Decades of Xylari military doctrine screamed that this was suicide. Xylari pilots relied on pristine firing lines and perfectly calculated vectors. They did not intentionally fly into a meat grinder. But Vial looked at the human, remembering the aborted warp core meltdown. The rigid rules of the Empire had failed them. It was time to embrace the chaotic intuition of a primitive. Vial slammed his fist onto the primary propulsion controls. The scout ship's engines flared with a desperate, blinding brilliance. Instead of fighting the pull, the smaller vessel surged forward and to the side, swinging wildly at the end of the invisible gravimetric leash. Aboard the Vanguard, the tactical officers were completely unprepared for the maneuver. The massive dreadnought was suddenly forced to adjust its lateral stabilizers to maintain the lock. But it was too late. The scout ship plunged headfirst into the swirling vortex of the asteroid field. The bridge became a sensory nightmare of blaring collision alarms and flashing red hazard lights. Massive, jagged chunks of space rock whipped past the viewport, some the size of small cities, spinning with lethal momentum. Vial fought the helm, his perfectly calculated steering inputs completely inadequate for the sheer randomized violence of the environment. A glancing blow from a smaller asteroid slammed into their port shields, sending a violent shockwave through the deck plating that threw Elias to the floor. "I cannot track the trajectories," Vial shouted over the grinding roar of the strained hull. "The sensor grid is overwhelmed by the sheer volume of particulate matter. We are flying blind." "Stop looking at the screens," Elias yelled, hauling himself back to his feet. "Lyra, we need your eyes." Lyra closed her dark, obsidian eyes. She did not look at the tactical readouts. Instead, she cast her telepathic net outward, feeling the immense shifting gravitational shadows of the asteroids as they tumbled through the void. The raw data of the chaotic field translated into pure, instinctive feeling within her mind. She reached out, bypassing verbal communication entirely, and forged a direct, agonizingly intense mental link with Vale. The alien commander gasped. His body rigid as a flood of alien intuition poured into his highly structured brain. He could suddenly feel the terrifying mass of a rogue asteroid approaching from below before the sensors even registered it. "A bank left," Lyra commanded, her physical voice a harsh whisper while her mental voice roared with absolute certainty inside Vial's head. "Drop the nose by 10 degrees, surge the thrusters." Vial stopped calculating. He surrendered his rigid training to the telepathic current, his hands moving the control yoke with a fluid, desperate grace he had never experienced before. The scout ship danced through the jagged labyrinth, narrowly avoiding a massive collision that would have reduced them to dust. Behind them, the Vanguard was losing the battle against physics. The dreadnought could not maneuver quickly enough to follow them into the dense field, and the invisible tractor beam was forced to drag through the heavy silicate rocks. The sheer friction and impact of the asteroids began to severely degrade the gravimetric tether. Infuriated, High Commander Kalen ordered the dreadnought to fire its main plasma batteries directly into the field. Brilliant, searing bolts of green energy tore through the void, vaporizing smaller rocks and creating a blinding, chaotic storm of superheated shrapnel. The scout ship's rear shields buckled under the secondary impacts. Consoles on the bridge sparked and exploded, raining hot debris onto the floor. The ship was sustaining heavy, critical damage. The hull groaned, the metallic integrity pushed past its absolute breaking point. "The tether is fraying," Vial announced, his voice tight with adrenaline. "But our shields are at 6%. One direct hit from those plasma batteries and we are finished." "Prepare the warp drive," Elias ordered, his eyes locked on the chaotic maelstrom outside the viewport. "We cannot jump from inside a gravity well this dense," Vale protested, the old rules fighting their way back to the surface. "The navigation computer requires a minimum of 10 minutes to calculate a clear vector through this debris. If we jump blindly, we could materialize inside a moon." "We do not have 10 minutes, Elias stated, his voice a calm, immovable anchor amidst the storm. "We have 10 seconds. Lyra, find the gap." Lyra pushed her telepathic abilities to their absolute limit, her bioluminescent markings flaring with an intense, burning light. She felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of the asteroids all around them, searching for a single momentary sliver of empty space aligning with their trajectory. Blood began to trickle from her nose, the sheer mental strain threatening to tear her consciousness apart. A massive, jagged rock the size of a continent rotated slowly in front of them, entirely blocking their path. The Vanguard's weapon systems locked onto the scout ship's rear thrusters, a massive accumulation of green energy signaling a world-ending strike. "There!" Lyra gasped, her eyes snapping open. "Dead ahead. The large mass is fracturing. There is a micro-fissure forming in its center. Punch it now." To the naked eye, it was solid rock. Vial had to choose between the absolute certainty of his visual input and the profound, shared intuition of his alien passengers. He chose the primitive. Vial slammed the hyperspace throttle forward, just as the Vanguard unleashed a colossal, searing beam of concentrated plasma. The massive asteroid in front of the scout ship split apart, the result of a prior collision deep within the field. A narrow, jagged tunnel of empty space opened for a fraction of a second. The scout ship shot through the microscopic gap, the hull scraping violently against the stone. The Vanguard's plasma beam struck the asteroid a millisecond later, shattering the enormous rock into a million pieces. But the scout ship was already gone, severing the weakened tractor beam, slipping through the tear in reality, and plunging into the smooth, swirling violet tunnel of hyperspace. The transition was violent, slamming everyone on the bridge to the deck. Then, there was only the eerie, frictionless hum of faster-than-light travel. The blaring collision alarms finally silenced, leaving only the sound of heavy, desperate breathing and the crackle of damaged circuitry. They had made it. They had outrun an empire by doing the impossible. Vial slowly pushed himself off the floor. His immaculate uniform was torn, his scales bruised, and his mind completely fractured by the sheer, unadulterated chaos he had just participated in. He looked at the main console, confirming they were deep in the slipstream, entirely untraceable. He did not say a single word. He simply turned and walked off the ruined bridge, desperately needing the mechanical solitude of the engineering deck to process the fact that everything he had ever been taught was wrong. Elias sat up, leaning his back against a charred command pedestal. He wiped a smudge of grease from his cheek and let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was rapidly draining from his system, leaving a heavy, profound exhaustion in its wake. He looked across the ruined bridge. Lyra was sitting on the floor a few feet away, her knees pulled up to her chest. The harsh red glow of her former collar was a distant memory, replaced by the soft, ambient light of the hyperspace tunnel bleeding through the viewport. She looked tired, fragile, but undeniably radiant. Elias crawled over the debris and sat down next to her. He did not offer a witty remark or a calculated observation. The master negotiator was finally quiet. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice completely devoid of any pretense or bravado. Lyra turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his. She did not project her thoughts into his mind. She simply reached out and took his hand, her pale fingers lacing perfectly with his. Her skin was cool, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat they had just escaped. "I am free," she whispered aloud, her physical voice carrying a beautiful melodic resonance that filled the quiet space between them. Elias tightened his grip on her hand, a profound sense of peace settling over him despite the wreckage surrounding them. They were millions of light years from home, trapped on a stolen, heavily damaged warship, with an entire galactic empire hunting them. But sitting there in the quiet aftermath, holding the hand of the woman who had just guided them through the fire. Elias Vance finally felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Coming home is usually a cause for celebration, unless your vehicle of choice happens to be a heavily armed, stolen extraterrestrial dreadnought bleeding raw radiation across the sky. For Elias Vance, returning to Earth was about to become the most dangerous negotiation of his life. The violent violet swirl of the hyperspace tunnel collapsed, spitting the battered Xylari scout ship into the cold, silent vacuum of the Sol system. Earth hung directly ahead, a breathtaking sphere of vibrant blue and swirling white clouds. For a fraction of a second, the bridge was completely silent. Vial stood at the ruined helm, his shoulders slumped in sheer exhaustion, while Lyra remained close to Elias, her eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the vibrant, water-rich world. The moment of peace lasted exactly 3 seconds before every proximity alarm on the bridge resurrected itself with a vengeance. A harsh, pulsating amber light bathed the ruined control room. The main view screen, heavily cracked from the asteroid collision, flickered to life, displaying a rapidly updating tactical overlay. Hundreds of red geometric targeting reticles suddenly blossomed across the orbital space surrounding their ship. "We have localized energy spikes," Vial announced, his hands flying across his damaged console, the ingrained military discipline overriding his fatigue. "Dozens of them. Solid projectile weapons are arming in low orbit. Ground-based energy grids are powering up across the planetary surface. Your people are locking onto us." "I told you we had not mastered fusion drives," Elias said, quickly moving toward the main communication array and stepping over a pile of sparking cables. "I never said we did not know how to build a very large gun. Humanity is incredibly primitive. Vial. Which means we are also incredibly paranoid. Earth did not have a unified global government or a spacefaring armada, but they possessed a highly classified, heavily automated orbital defense grid, designed in secret by a paranoid coalition of international superpowers to shoot down rogue satellites and hypothetical meteors. The grid was currently looking at a massive, unidentifiable metallic anomaly that had just ripped a hole in the fabric of space-time right above the Atlantic Ocean. To the automated systems of Earth, it was an alien invasion. "The targeting lasers are active," Vial warned, his voice rising in panic. "They are preparing to launch a coordinated volley of high-yield thermonuclear devices. Our shields are at 6%. A single localized blast will shatter the hull and vaporize us." "Transfer the main communication feed to my console," Elias ordered, his fingers dancing across the alien holographic interface. He route it through the ship's universal translator, but boost the signal strength. "I want to override every secure military frequency on the North American continent." Vial hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied, slamming his palm against the routing node. Deep within the subterranean bunkers of the Pentagon and across secure command centers from London to Beijing, encrypted monitors suddenly went black. The digitized maps and radar sweeps vanished, replaced by the high-definition live video feed of a man in a ruined, soot-stained charcoal suit standing on the bridge of an alien spacecraft. "General Hackett, I know your finger is hovering over the authorization key, and I strongly suggest you put it back in your pocket." Elias spoke into the open channel, his voice echoing simultaneously in dozens of highly classified human military installations. Thousands of miles below, in a sterile command bunker, a 4-star general stared at the main screen in absolute disbelief. "Elias Vance?" General Hackett's voice crackled through the ship's speakers, a mixture of profound shock and deeply ingrained suspicion. "You vanished off the grid 48 hours ago. Satellite imaging just flagged a massive unidentified thermal bloom in orbit. What in God's name are you sitting inside?" "I am currently sitting inside a Xylari Empire scout vessel," Elias replied smoothly, adopting the commanding, authoritative tone that had made him the most feared political fixer on Earth. "And before you decide to swat me out of the sky with your orbital railguns, I need you to listen very carefully. You are currently pointing weapons at the single greatest technological leap in human history. You are piloting an unauthorized, heavily armed alien craft in restricted airspace," Hackett countered, the military protocol hardening his voice. You have 10 seconds to surrender the vessel and prepare for boarding, or we will authorize a kinetic strike. Do not play poker with me, Arthur, Elias shot back, his eyes narrowing. I know exactly what you are holding. You have 12 orbital kinetic rods and a handful of refurbished ICBMs. If you fire them at this ship, our automated deflector shields will not absorb the impact. They will reflect the kinetic energy directly back along the trajectory of the strike. You will essentially be glassing the entire eastern seaboard. Are you prepared to explain that to the president? It was a complete monumental bluff. The ship's shields could barely stop a stiff breeze, let alone a kinetic bombardment. Lyra glanced at Elias, feeling the sheer, unadulterated audacity radiating from his mind. Vial stood frozen, realizing that the human was currently using the exact same tactic on his own species that he had used on the Xylari. The radio channel fell dead silent. Elias knew he had them. The military mind despised unknown variables, and he had just introduced a catastrophic one. "What are your terms, Vance?" Hackett finally asked, his voice strained and heavy with reluctant concession. "My terms are a paradigm shift," Elias declared, pacing slowly in front of the console. "And this ship contains working blueprints for faster-than-light travel, localized gravity manipulation, and clean, infinite thermal energy. I am bringing you the fire of the gods. Hack it. But I am not handing it over to a single government to be locked in a dark room and weaponized. The old rules are dead." Elias leaned closer to the visual pickup, his gaze piercing. "I am formally declaring this vessel sovereign, independent territory. It is the first interstellar embassy of Earth. You will stand down your defense grid immediately. In exchange, I will establish a unified diplomatic council. I will share the technology equally with every nation on this planet, provided they agree to a complete, immediate cessation of all global armed conflicts. If anyone fires a shot on Earth, the technology stream stops." It was a staggering demand. Elias was leveraging the alien technology to force a mandatory global peace treaty. He was holding the entire planet hostage with the promise of a utopian future. "You cannot unilaterally dictate global policy," Hackett argued, though the conviction was rapidly draining from his voice. "The geopolitical ramifications are impossible to calculate." "Calculate them later." Elias dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "Right now, you have a choice. You can blow me out of the sky and plunge humanity back into the Dark Ages, or you can lower your weapons, look up at the stars, and realize that we finally have a seat at the adult table. I need your answer." "General, my shields are getting restless." The seconds ticked by, heavy and suffocating. The entire bridge crew held their breath. If Hackett called the bluff, they would be reduced to ash in the upper atmosphere of their own sanctuary. Then, the tactical overlay on the main screen shifted. The red geometric targeting reticles slowly turned green, then vanished entirely one by one. The shrill proximity alarms ceased. The defense grid was powering down. "We are standing by, Ambassador Vance." Hackett's voice came through, completely stripped of its military hostility. "Awaiting your coordinates for the diplomatic envoy." Elias cut the transmission. He braced his hands on the edge of the console, his head dropping forward as a massive, shuddering breath escaped his lungs. The final bluff had held. He had navigated the deadly labyrinth of interstellar warfare and human paranoia, emerging completely victorious. Vial stepped forward, his eyes locked on the blue and green sphere rotating peacefully outside the viewport. The alien commander had been trained to view primitive species as chaotic, disorganized animals requiring the firm, guiding hand of an empire. But he had just watched a single human manipulate the combined military might of a planet using nothing but leverage and a profound understanding of fear and desire. "You did not conquer them," Vale said softly, a note of genuine awe entering his rigid vocabulary. You simply gave them a reason to stop fighting. True power is not forcing someone to do what you want, Elias replied, turning to face the alien commander. It is making them realize that what you want is exactly what they need. Elias walked over to Lyra. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin were glowing with a warm, steady rhythm. She had felt the massive, sweeping wave of relief and hope that had just washed over the minds of the human leaders below. She reached out, placing her hand gently against Elias's chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. The battle was won, and the ship was secure. But as Elias looked out at the stars, watching the dark void where the Xylari Armada still lurked, he knew the galaxy was vast, and the High Command would not easily forget the human who had stolen their prize. The real work of building a new world was only just beginning, and they were going to need every ounce of leverage they had left. A cage is only a prison if you lock the door from the outside. Otherwise, it is simply a fortress. The Xylari scout ship, scarred by plasma burns and battered by billions of tons of jagged silicate rock, now rested in a perfectly synchronized geostationary orbit high above the Atlantic Ocean. It was no longer a vessel of terror sent to abduct and conquer. It was a sovereign island in the sky, a heavily armed beacon of a brand new era, and Elias Vance was the man holding the keys to the drawbridge. The initial panic on Earth had subsided, replaced by a frenzied, desperate scramble for diplomatic positioning. Down below, military tribunals and closed-door political summits were tearing up centuries of geopolitical strategy. Elias had made good on his promise. He transmitted a fraction of the ship's medical database directly to the World Health Organization, a gesture of goodwill that completely cured 3 major planetary diseases overnight. The message was clear. The technology was real, the benefits were unfathomable, but the price of admission was absolute global unity. The nations of Earth had to put down their weapons if they wanted to reach the stars. And for the first time in human history, the incentive was simply too massive to ignore. Aboard the newly christened embassy, the internal dynamic of the alien crew was undergoing a revolution of its own. Commander Vial stood in the center of the ruined bridge, staring at the vibrant blue sphere dominating the main viewport. His immaculate uniform was gone, replaced by comfortable, dark, human clothing Elias had requested in the first supply drop from the surface. The heavy gold-plated insignia of the Xylari High Command sat completely abandoned on a charred command console. Elias walked onto the bridge, carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs. He handed one to Vial. The towering alien accepted it cautiously, examining the dark, aromatic liquid inside. It is called coffee, Elias explained, taking a sip from his own mug. It is a mild stimulant. It tastes terribly bitter at first, but you learn to appreciate the clarity it provides. Consider it the official beverage of human negotiation. Vial took a slow, measured sip. His scaled ridges flushed a deep, surprised violet as the strong, earthy flavor hit his palate. It was chaotic, acidic, and entirely unregulated, a stark contrast to the perfectly balanced, flavorless nutritional pastes he had consumed for 80 solar cycles. He took another sip, finding he did not hate it. The Vanguard has undoubtedly reported our survival and defection to the homeworld, Vial said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former military arrogance. High Commander Kalen will demand retribution. The Empire does not allow rogue assets to exist, especially assets that possess stolen technology and classified banking ledgers. Let them demand, Elias replied, leaning against the railing. By the time they calculate a retaliation strategy and navigate the bureaucratic red tape required to launch a full-scale invasion of a protected sector, Earth will have reverse-engineered your deflector shields. We will not be a divided, primitive nursery world anymore. We will be waiting for them. Vial looked at Elias, a profound realization settling over his structured mind. The High Command failed because they demanded absolute perfection, and perfection shatters the moment it encounters the unpredictable. Humanity survived because they were inherently flawed, chaotic, and relentlessly adaptable. The rigidity of authoritarianism had been utterly dismantled by the sheer, unyielding force of empathy and flexibility. "I have spoken to the surviving crew," Vial stated, setting his mug down. "And the loyalists you trapped in the ventilation shafts have requested to be transferred to a stasis pod and launched toward the neutral zone. They refuse to accept this new paradigm. I have granted their request." "And the others?" Elias asked. "The others wish to stay," Vial answered, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "They have spent their entire lives reading manuals and following orders. They are terrified of your species, Elias, but they are far more terrified of going back to the dark. They wish to claim asylum on this embassy. They want to learn how to be unpredictable. Welcome to the chaotic side of the universe, Vial," Elias said, raising his mug in a silent toast. "We have terrible traffic, but the food is infinitely better." Leaving Vial to manage the ship's repairs, Elias walked out of the bridge and made his way to the observation deck. The large, curved window offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the cosmos. Lyra was standing there, bathed in the soft, ambient starlight. She wore a flowing, pale garment brought up from Earth, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with a steady, serene rhythm. Without the oppressive metal collar dampening her abilities, her telepathic presence was no longer confined to the ship. She was currently reaching out, brushing her consciousness against the vast, swirling ocean of minds down on the planet below. Elias stepped up beside her. He did not speak, simply allowing the quiet intimacy of the moment to settle between them. "It is deafening," Lyra whispered aloud, her eyes filled with tears of absolute wonder. "Billions of minds. They are so loud. Elias, they are frightened and angry and hopelessly confused. But beneath all of that noise, there is an incredible, beautiful undercurrent of hope. It is a symphony. The Xylari minds were just a single, monotone drone. This world is a masterpiece of chaos." "It takes some getting used to," Elias agreed, reaching out to gently trace the line of her jaw. "We are a messy species. We make terrible mistakes, but we also know how to build something better out of the wreckage." Lyra leaned into his touch, her dark eyes locking onto his. The telepathic bond between them flared, sharing a profound, silent promise. They had survived an abduction, dismantled an empire from the inside, and forced an entire planet to change its course. The romantic spark that had ignited in the sterile confines of a diplomatic suite had forged itself into an unbreakable partnership. "The biodrive you swallowed," Lyra projected softly into his mind, a playful curiosity coloring her thoughts. "Is it still active?" Elias offered a slow, wicked grin. "It is currently dormant, resting comfortably in my intestinal tract. But the dead man's switch is still perfectly viable. If anyone decides to launch a missile at our new home, the entire galaxy gets to see Commander Vial's offshore bank accounts. A good negotiator never throws away his leverage." They turned back to the window, watching the slow rotation of the Earth below and the infinite, glittering expanse of the stars above. The Xylari Armada was out there, nursing its bruised ego and plotting its revenge. Other empires, ancient and terrible, lurked in the dark corners of the Orion Spur. The universe was dangerous, entirely unpredictable, and absolutely teeming with hostile forces who believed they could dictate the terms of existence. But as Elias held Lyra close, looking out from the bridge of the most powerful diplomatic outpost in the sector. He knew they were ready. The first human to be taken hostage had officially changed the rules of the game, and the entire galaxy was about to find out exactly what happened when you tried to negotiate with Earth. Thank you for watching this journey into the unknown. The universe is a vast, unpredictable place, and stories like this are just the beginning of the adventures we can explore together. If you enjoyed this high-stakes galactic negotiation, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your fellow travelers. Drop the word leverage in the comments below to let me know you made it to the very end of the story. And please, hit that hype button so the algorithm knows to send this video to more viewers exactly like you. Your support keeps the stories flowing. Until next time, keep looking up at the stars.